So this is our last arts lesson of the year, and I'm going to go over 2 styles of architecture that we haven't yet covered. And then I believe you're going to do an activity where you review artwork from the 20th century and also look at some contemporary artwork. So the first style is modern architecture. Modern architecture tries to use modern materials and things that really demonstrate the use of technology, advancing beyond typical materials like brick and stone and things like that. It also often uses unusual shapes, which we'll look at some examples of that in a minute. And they reject historical or classical elements like pediments or columns. Pediments are this triangular shape that you see in the image. So think about classical pieces of architecture like, say, the Parthenon of Greece, that style. Modern architecture totally rejects that. They also, a lot of them use or want to incorporate natural light and the use of glass to bring light into the buildings without artificial lighting on the inside. So the first example here is the Bauhaus School in Germany, which was built in the 1920s. And I believe you've probably already looked at this a little bit in class before. But this is part of the functionalist school. And the functionalists really wanted to make a building just that was totally functional. So they don't have any kind of extraneous decoration on the outside. Another characteristic that shows the modernist characteristics I talked about is definitely the use of glass and light. So if you look at the building, you can just imagine the light pouring in and how that would cause them to not have to use as much artificial lighting on the inside. Again, we see that there's pretty much no classical elements present in this architecture. This one is the Georges Pompidou Center in Paris, which was built in the 1970s. And just take a minute and look at the materials used here. So we have exposed metal, lots of steel. It looks very futuristic. There are no classical elements present. It really, if you think about the fact that this was built in the 70s, it especially would have looked very futuristic in that time period. Here's another one, the Notre Dame des Hautes in France, which was built in the 1950s. And this is a church. Here we really see reflected the modernist style of unusual shapes. And supposedly what this was designed to look like is a nun's habit, which for us, I mean, it doesn't look like any nun's habit I've ever seen. But if you look at the image of the nun on the left, which is an example of some of the traditional habits that nuns wore in France, you can kind of start to see a little bit more how that's reflected. You can also, if you look closely, see an unusual use of glass and light. So you can see the unusual placement of the windows on the side. And then the last one, the Guggenheim Bilbao Museo in Spain, which was built in 1997. And here we definitely see use of unusual shapes. We see lots of exposed metal, very futuristic looking, definitely rejecting any sort of classical elements found in previous styles of architecture. And the second style we'll look at is postmodernist architecture. So this is kind of a reaction to kind of the extreme of modernist architecture that we just looked at. So a lot of these architects feel that modern architecture is too cold and industrial looking. And so they try to make kind of a hybrid between both modern elements like we just looked at and more traditional elements. So one example here is the AT&T building in New York, which was built in the 1980s. And we can see it looks, the bottom part, I think looks pretty industrial. I mean, it's pretty basic, very linear, lots of windows. But at the top, we have kind of an homage to a classical style with the pediment, triangular shape at the top. Another example is the Piazza d'Italia, which is in New Orleans. So you can see during the day, it looks very much almost like it could be found in Italy in terms of the columns and the classical architecture. And at night, it comes alive with more modern elements like neon. So again, postmodernism really tries to blend both classical and modern elements. So I believe what you're going to do now is an activity to review 20th and 21st century artistic movements. You're going to group the works of art together by artistic movements, and then you'll go over them as a class. There's also, I believe, 4 contemporary artworks. Art historians have a lot of trouble classifying contemporary artworks into specific movements because they're so diverse. But one of the things that you can really think about is how do these particular artworks reflect what was going on in the world from 1970 to the present. And when you go over it, you all can discuss that question as a class.